Hi, everyone. I'm Anne-Marie Green. President Obama has finished talks with his national security team about the U.S. efforts to combat ISIS. The meeting follows a weekend of heavy airstrikes in Syria carried out by U.S.-led coalition forces. The Pentagon says the strikes targeted the ISIS stronghold of Raqqa. Now the president has said that he will not put combat boots on the ground in Syria, but he's also admitted the U.S. has no complete strategy to fight ISIS.
This will not be quick. This is a long-term campaign. ISIL is opportunistic and it is nimble. In many places in Syria and Iraq, including urban areas, it's dug in among innocent civilian populations. It will take time to root them out. And doing so must be the job of local forces on the ground with training and air support from our coalition. As with any military effort, there will be periods of progress, but there are also going to be some setbacks, as we've seen with ISIL's gains in Ramadi in Iraq and central and southern Syria. But today it's also important for us to recognize the progress that's been made. Our coalition's now hit ISIL with more than 5,000 airstrikes. We've taken out thousands of fighting positions, tanks, vehicles, bomb factories, and training camps. We've eliminated thousands of fighters, including senior ISIL commanders. And over the past year, we've seen that when we have an effective partner on the ground, ISIL can be pushed back. In Iraq, ISIL lost at the Mosul Dam. ISIL lost at Mount Sinjar. ISIL has lost repeatedly across Kirkuk province. ISIL lost at Tikrit. Altogether, ISIL has lost more than a quarter of the populated areas that it had seized in Iraq. In Syria, ISIL lost at Kobani. It's recently endured losses across northern Syria, including the key city of Tal Abyad, denying ISIL a vital supply route to Raqqa, its base of operations in Syria. So these are reminders that ISIL's strategic weaknesses are real.
After the president spoke, we talked to Major Garrett from the White House.
The president at the top said this is going to take a long time. So for anyone in the American audience, anyone in Congress who is expecting the president to say, you know, we've got them on the run, that's not happening. There are some signs of progress, but there are significant signs of setback, and the president basically said this is an open-ended commitment. This is a long-running military campaign with no end in sight. He said that before, but every time the president says it, to my mind, that's news, because he, better than anyone, knows what the timeline is, what he would like it to be, and it's very clear to me, whenever the president repeats that, this is going to be a long process. It's not only open-ended, but likely to be inherited by the next president of the United States. The second thing that struck me is that the president spent very little time talking about the tactical messiness of Iraq and Syria. And he spent a very great deal of time talking about the larger philosophical construct of dealing with what he called the demented ideology of ISIS, calling upon Muslim communities, not just in America, but across the world, to denounce it, to reject it, and to partner nations in the region to be more effective in stopping the flow of foreign fighters, challenging publicly the hateful ideology, and in the president's own words, not feeding and or fueling sectarian strife within the region. That's the president shifting his rhetoric a little bit to the larger construct of this battle with ISIS, saying there are reasons it exists, there are reasons it recruits, and unless those in the Muslim community who are threatened by the rise of ISIS do more and say more publicly, this is not going to be won anytime soon. So I just thought the proportional relationship of a lot of rhetoric about what the broader world needs to do, what the Muslim world needs to do, what the community and the government level needs to do, about the ideology of ISIS and about the future of Islam itself was significant, because the president doesn't usually spend that much time on that part of the equation. That he did now suggests to me he is trying to move nations in a direction they haven't yet gone.
Yeah, it was interesting to me, the discussion of the various platforms on which this fight is taking place, like you brought up. We're talking about online, we're also talking about military, the coalition, and he also talked about what he called a glimmer of hope that at least some of the nations in the area recognize that in order to stop ISIS and in order to make sure that ISIS doesn't return, you need an inclusive government in Syria, which meant one without Bashar al-Assad.
That's a glimmer of hope, and there are many, many things between a glimmer of hope and the reality of life in Syria with a new government that's multi-sectarian that does not include the Bashar al-Assad regime. The Assad regime is teetering, there's no question about that, and there may be a broader consensus on the outside that he needs to go. But how to create that political situation and then what to replace it with in Syria, which has basically become a failed state of enormous size with, as I mentioned before the president's remarks started, 3 or 4, depending on how you count them, maybe up to 6 different civil wars going on throughout that country, massive refugee outflows into all the neighboring countries. I mean, Syria is an enormous problem, and it doesn't get solved if Assad steps down. It creates possibilities for solutions, but nobody has the idea or the roadmap to create them once Assad steps down, if he ever does. But the president did hint in ways he hasn't before that in the conversations he's having with people in the region, they have begun to see a life in Syria post-Assad, which is not something he'd said publicly before.
Yeah, Major, the other thing that I wanted to ask you about is the president said if there's one thing that Congress can do, it was to confirm Adam Zubin as the Treasury Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Crimes. Tell us about that position and what's going on with that.
That position sits at the nexus, if you will, of all Treasury Department activity to siphon off and, if possible, eliminate entirely flows of money to terrorist organizations, ISIS and every other kind. Our esteemed CBS colleague Juan Zarate used to be part of that process in the Bush administration. He has spoken with great depth and eloquence on our air about some of the tools that the Treasury Department uses in collaboration with other foreign governments to choke off terrorist financing. That's a position that the president has nominated Adam Zubin for. That nomination is waiting for the Senate Republicans to have first a hearing, not even a committee confirmation vote. That hearing hasn't occurred yet, with the White House press secretary earlier today and now the president now. Clearly the White House is trying to push that higher up the agenda here in Washington, get Adam Zubin a hearing, a vote in committee, and a confirmation before Congress leaves for its lengthy recess at the beginning of August, so in the next 3 to 4 weeks.
All right, Major Garrett at the White House, thank you very much.